Hey there. Tonight we begin a journey through the frothy, fermented heart of medieval Europe, where beer wasn't just a weekend indulgence, but the liquid cornerstone of daily survival. And just to set expectations properly, if you were to time travel back to sample these medieval brews, your modern palate probably wouldn't survive the first sip without gagging. So, before you drift off completely, like this video and subscribe, only if this kind of sleepy narration is your thing. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. Now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. Imagine, if you will, waking up in a medieval village. The first light of dawn creeps through the cracks in your timber-framed house, and before your feet even touch the packed earth floor, your thoughts turn to beer. Not because you're a raging alcoholic, but because in medieval Europe, beer wasn't just a drink, it was, quite literally, liquid bread. While modern nutritionists might wince at the notion, medieval beer contributed somewhere between 10 to 30% of the daily caloric intake for the average person. When harvest failures threatened and bread became scarce, that foamy beverage became even more crucial to survival. Medieval beer bore little resemblance to the craft IPAs that modern hipsters sip while discussing their vinyl collection. This was a thick, cloudy substance, often the consistency of a thin porridge filled with floating bits of grain and active yeast. You wouldn't so much drink it as chew your way through it. Sounds appetizing, doesn't it? Yet this murky concoction was the reliable nutrition that powered castle construction, cathedral building, and field plowing across Europe for centuries. The brewing process itself was a form of food preservation. In an age without refrigeration, turning barley and other grains into beer extended their usable life from weeks to months. A failed grain harvest might mean starvation by spring, but that same grain converted to beer could sustain a family through the lean months. Beer was stable, transportable nutrition that wouldn't spoil nearly as quickly as bread or raw grain. The caloric value of medieval beer shouldn't be underestimated. While modern commercial beers might contain around 150 calories per pint, their medieval counterparts could pack upwards of 400-500 calories in the same volume. This wasn't just about the higher alcohol content, though that certainly contributed, but about the substantial amount of partially fermented carbohydrates, proteins, and nutrients that remained suspended in the drink. You weren't just getting tipsy, you were consuming liquid cereal. Interestingly, scholars still debate exactly how much of medieval Europe's caloric intake came from beer. Some regions clearly relied on it more heavily than others. In Northern Europe, where grape cultivation proved challenging and wine remained a luxury of the elite, beer consumption reached staggering levels. Records from some medieval English manors suggest daily consumption rates of a gallon per person, and that's not counting special occasions or festivals where consumption might double or triple. The nutritional aspect of beer was well understood, even if the science behind it wasn't. Medieval physicians, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman medical traditions, prescribed beer for various ailments, particularly those related to nutrition and digestion. The 12th century abbess and medical writer Hildegard von Bingen specifically recommended beer for its strengthening properties, noting that it makes the flesh of men strong and provides them with good complexion. She wasn't wrong. B vitamins abundant in beer helped prevent diseases like beriberi and pellagra that often ravaged malnourished populations. For the poorest segments of society, beer might be the only reliable source of certain nutrients. When bread was made from the lowest quality flour, stretched with fillers like ground peas, beans, or even tree bark during famine years, beer made from malted barley represented a nutritional lifeline. The malting process, essentially allowing grain to begin germinating before halting the process with heat, makes certain nutrients more bioavailable. Medieval peasants couldn't articulate the biochemistry, but they understood the sustaining power of a good brew. And let's be clear, medieval people drank beer at all hours of the day. The morning started with a beer break, midday meal, accompanied by beer, afternoon work, punctuated by beer breaks, evening relaxation, more beer. This wasn't considered problematic drinking. It was essential nutrition and hydration. When water sources were suspect, more on that in our next section, beer provided the moisture necessary for survival in a safer form. The strength of these beers varied widely, with many everyday brews being significantly lower in alcohol than modern beers. Small beer or table beer might have had as little as 1 to 2% alcohol content, enough to kill harmful microorganisms, but not enough to leave the entire medieval population in a perpetual state of intoxication. That said, stronger varieties certainly existed and were consumed with predictable effects, particularly during festivals and celebrations. Perhaps most telling about beer's importance as food is the fact that brewing was regulated as a food production activity. When medieval towns established assize laws controlling the price, quality, and measure of bread, they typically did the same for beer in the same ordinances. The assize of bread and ale, established in England in 1266 by Henry III, specifically linked the two, regulating both according to grain prices. This legal connection formalized what everyone already knew. Beer wasn't a luxury or an indulgence. It was a dietary staple as fundamental as bread itself. The year is 1320, and you're standing on a bridge overlooking a typical medieval city river. Below you, a tanner dumps chemical waste from leather processing directly into the water. 10 yards downstream, a butcher tosses animal entrails over his back into the same flow. Further along, several citizens are using the riverbank as their personal toilet, while someone empties a chamber pot from an overhanging window. Observing this revolting scene, a fellow townsperson casually mentions they're headed down to fill their water jug. You'd sooner drink from a modern gas station toilet than take a sip from that medieval waterway. And this, dear listener, is precisely why everyone was drinking beer instead. The danger of medieval water sources cannot be overstated. While pure spring water existed and was recognized as superior when available, most medieval settlements developed around rivers and streams that quickly became repositories for every kind of human and industrial waste imaginable. By the time a typical medieval town had grown to any significant size, its primary water source had essentially transformed into an open sewer. Medieval towns lacked anything resembling modern waste management systems. The concept of separating drinking water from waste disposal was understood in theory. Roman aqueducts had demonstrated this principle centuries earlier, but practical implementation had largely disappeared with the collapse of Roman infrastructure. Instead, medieval Europeans adopted a frighteningly simple approach. Everything went into the nearest waterway under the assumption that it would all just flow away. The industries that powered medieval economies were particularly devastating to water quality. Tanners used urine and animal brains in their leather curing process, with the runoff flowing directly into community water sources. Textile production required extensive washing and dyeing, introducing chemical pollutants. Butchers, simply as a matter of convenience, used rivers to wash away blood and offal. Blacksmiths, potters, and other craftsmen each contributed their share of contaminants. Human waste management was equally primitive. While some larger towns had rudimentary sewers by the late medieval period, these typically emptied directly into the same rivers from which drinking water was drawn. Most households relied on cesspits that frequently leaked into groundwater, or simply emptied waste directly into streets, where it would eventually wash into waterways during rainfall. The medieval saying, "Gardas elo," watch out for the water, wasn't a warning about flooding. It was shouted before someone emptied a chamber pot from an upper window. Contemporary accounts make clear that medieval people weren't oblivious to the fouling of their water sources. Town regulations frequently prohibited certain activities too close to water sources, though enforcement was spotty at best. More telling are the numerous complaints preserved in legal records about neighbors or businesses polluting wells or streams. In 1309, Edward II of England responded to complaints from the Abbot of Hales that the town of Winchcombe was polluting the abbey's water supply. Similar disputes appear regularly in court records across Europe. While medieval people lacked germ theory, they weren't entirely ignorant about water quality. They could observe the connection between stagnant, foul-smelling water and illness, even if they attributed this to miasma or bad air rather than microscopic organisms. Clean-looking, good-tasting water from springs was preferred when available. here's the critical point. Most people didn't have reliable access to such sources, especially in growing urban centers. Scholarly debate continues about just how dangerous medieval water actually was. Some historians argue that contemporaries exaggerated water pollution, noting that many communities maintained strict regulations about water sources. Others point out that natural water sources outside towns might have been relatively safe. However, archaeological evidence consistently reveals high levels of human and animal parasites in medieval cesspits and waterways, suggesting that waterborne diseases were a very real threat. Beer provided a brilliant solution to this water problem, though medieval brewers didn't understand the science behind why it worked. The brewing process required boiling the water, which killed many pathogens. The alcohol content, even in weak, small beer, created an environment hostile to many harmful microorganisms. Additionally, the slightly acidic pH of beer further inhibited bacterial growth. The end result: drinking beer was significantly safer than consuming untreated water from contaminated sources. This safety advantage became particularly apparent during disease outbreaks. During plague periods, contemporary observers noted that monastery brewers often survived at higher rates than the general population. While they attributed this to divine protection, modern understanding suggests that monks' habit of drinking primarily beer instead of water offered significant protection against waterborne illnesses that would have weakened immunity and made individuals more susceptible to other diseases. The relationship between water quality and beer consumption varied geographically. In regions with access to clean spring water or well-maintained wells, beer consumption might be more moderate. In densely populated urban centers with heavily polluted water sources, beer consumption reached remarkable levels. By some estimates, annual beer consumption in late medieval German and Flemish towns reached as high as 300 liters per person per year, a figure that includes every man, woman, and child. A fascinating twist in this narrative is that while medieval people drank beer partly to avoid waterborne illness, they were often using the same contaminated water sources to make their beer. The crucial difference was that brewing involved boiling, which killed many pathogens. Recipes and brewing manuals often specified boiling times for wort, the liquid extracted from the mashing process before fermentation, that far exceeded what was strictly necessary for the brewing process, suggesting an intuitive understanding that longer boiling produced safer beer. Remember, too, that while beer was safer than water, it wasn't completely safe by modern standards. Medieval brewing took place in environments we would consider wildly unsanitary. Fermentation vessels weren't sterilized. Wild yeasts contributed unpredictably to fermentation, and quality control was rudimentary at best. The bacterial contamination that makes modern homebrewers obsess over sanitization was simply accepted as part of the brewing process. Medieval beer might have been safer than the local river water, but it would almost certainly fail modern food safety inspections. The year is 1147, and you've been traveling for days through the dense forests of Bavaria, when finally, the modest stone walls of a Benedictine monastery appear through the trees. Exhausted and hungry, you're welcomed by the monks who, following the rule of Saint Benedict, offer hospitality to all travelers. What they serve you first isn't a bowl of thin gruel or a crust of bread. It's a tankard of their house-brewed beer, richer and more refined than anything you've tasted in the villages you've passed through. You've just encountered one of medieval Europe's most important brewing centers, where the marriage of piety and beer production would transform European drinking habits forever. Monasteries stood at the vanguard of medieval brewing science, perfecting techniques that would eventually percolate outward to secular society. The connection between monks and brewing stretches back to the earliest days of European monasticism, with the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, specifically mentioning beer as an acceptable daily beverage for monks. Benedict's famous directive that monks should live by the labor of their hands found perfect expression in brewing, a productive craft that yielded both nutrition for the community and potential income through sales to outsiders. The monastic advantage in brewing came down to 3 crucial factors: literacy, stability, and wealth. Unlike most medieval laypeople, monks could read and write, allowing them to record and refine brewing recipes over generations. Their monastic vows meant knowledge transfer could continue uninterrupted for centuries within the same institution. Finally, monasteries had the capital to invest in substantial brewing equipment and facilities that far outstripped what was possible in peasant households. By the 9th century, monastic brewing operations had grown from simple kitchens meeting internal needs to sophisticated production facilities. Floor plans from the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, dating to around 820, show dedicated brewing facilities with separate areas for malting, brewing, and fermentation, a level of specialization that wouldn't become common outside monastery walls for centuries. The most advanced monasteries eventually developed multiple brewing facilities, one for the stronger beer consumed by the monks themselves, another for the beer offered to guests and travelers, and sometimes a third producing beer for sale to the surrounding community. Monastic brewing innovations were numerous and consequential. Monks experimented with different grain combinations, discovering that barley made superior brewing material. They pioneered the use of hops as a preservative and flavoring agent, gradually replacing the earlier herbal mixtures known as gruit. perhaps most importantly, they developed the concept of lagering, storing beer in cool caves beneath the monastery to age and clarify, a technique that eventually led to entire beer styles, like the German lagers, that dominate global beer markets today. The demand for monastic beer grew beyond the monastery walls, leading many houses to establish taverns either within the monastery grounds or in nearby settlements. These ecclesiastical taverns often enjoyed special privileges, such as exemption from local taxes or brewing restrictions, much to the frustration of secular brewers who complained bitterly about unfair competition. Records from 13th century London show repeated conflicts between the city's Brewers' Guild and taverns operated by Westminster Abbey and other religious houses. But wait, weren't monks supposed to be focused on prayer and spiritual matters rather than becoming medieval beer barons? The tension between monastic brewing as economic enterprise and brewing as necessary sustenance created occasional controversies within the church. Bernard of Clairvaux, founder of the strict Cistercian order, criticized monks who had become too focused on brewing commercially at the expense of their spiritual duties. Nevertheless, the economic reality was clear. Beer production generated substantial income that supported monasteries' charitable works, manuscript production, and building projects. Different monastic orders developed distinctive brewing traditions that sometimes survive to this day. The Benedictines emphasized moderation, but high quality, producing beers that became known for their consistency and refinement. Cistercians, despite Bernard's concerns, eventually embraced brewing as an acceptable form of manual labor, developing techniques for large-scale production. The Trappists, an offshoot of the Cistercians, became so associated with quality brewing that Trappist beer remains a protected designation for brews made at a handful of monasteries in Belgium and the Netherlands. Monks also played a crucial role in standardizing brewing measures and practices. In an age before scientific instruments, brewing relied heavily on visual cues, taste, and experience. Monastic brewers developed practical tests and benchmarks, like checking if a wooden stick would stand upright in a wort to determine its thickness. That could be taught to novices and maintained consistent quality across brewing batches. These techniques eventually spread to secular brewers, helping to professionalize the entire industry. The transmission of brewing knowledge from monasteries to secular society followed multiple paths. Some lay workers employed in monastic brewhouses eventually left to establish their own operations. Travelers who had enjoyed monastic beer sought to recreate it in their home regions. In some cases, monasteries explicitly taught brewing techniques to surrounding communities as part of their charitable mission, particularly in regions recovering from famines or plagues, where nutritional knowledge was desperately needed. often the primary beneficiaries of this knowledge transfer, while brewing would eventually become male-dominated. More on that in Section 6. Throughout much of the medieval period, brewing was considered women's work. Monastic records show that monasteries frequently taught brewing techniques to local women, sometimes employing them as assistants in the brewery. The 13th century English noblewoman Alix de Rosny is recorded as having specifically sought brewing instruction from the monks at Waverley Abbey to improve production on her estates. The relationship between monastic brewing and secular brewing wasn't always harmonious. As towns grew and brewing became more commercialized, tensions arose between monastery brewhouses and urban brewers' guilds. In many regions, monasteries enjoyed tax exemptions and other privileges that secular brewers viewed as unfair advantages. The archives of medieval German cities contain numerous petitions from brewing guilds seeking restrictions on monastery beer sales within town limits. Perhaps the greatest legacy of monastic brewing was the introduction of hops as a standard beer ingredient. Before the widespread adoption of hops, beer was typically flavored and preserved with gruit, a mixture of herbs that might include bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, and various other plants, depending on regional availability. Monastic brewers, particularly in northern Germany, recognized that hops not only imparted a pleasant bitterness, but also significantly extended beer's shelf life. By the 12th century, hopped beer was firmly established in monastic brewing tradition, though it would take several more centuries to completely displace gruit beers in secular brewing. As you drift toward sleep, picture those quiet monastery brewhouses where monks combined prayer with brewing, unaware that their careful refinement of brewing techniques would eventually shape a global industry. Their patient experimentation, written records, and commitment to quality transformed brewing from a crude household necessity to a sophisticated craft with its own body of technical knowledge. The next time you enjoy a beer with a clean, bitter finish from hops, raise a silent toast to those tonsured brewmasters who helped make it possible. Dawn breaks over a medieval English manor. The harvest has just been completed, and the Lord's Reeve is overseeing the distribution of payment to the laborers who have spent weeks gathering crops. But there's something curious about this payday. Instead of receiving coins, many workers are lining up beside large barrels, holding out jugs and containers. They're being paid in beer. As strange as it might seem to your modern sensibilities, you're witnessing one of medieval Europe's most common economic transactions. Beer functioning as a liquid form of currency. Beer's role in medieval economics went far beyond mere beverage. In many regions, particularly before the widespread monetization of rural economies, beer served as a standardized medium of exchange, a role we typically associate with coinage. This wasn't some quirky local custom, but a widespread economic practice spanning centuries and continents, underpinning everything from labor relations to taxation systems to rental agreements. Payment in beer, known variously as drink penny, beer money, or simply as part of one's customary rights, appears consistently in manorial records across medieval Europe. The Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's Great Survey of England, completed in 1086, records numerous instances where tenants owed their lords specific quantities of beer, alongside other in-kind payments. In some cases, these beer obligations were quite substantial, the equivalent of hundreds of gallons annually from a single settlement. Labor arrangements frequently included beer as a significant component of compensation. Harvest workers might receive daily beer allowances in addition to their monetary wages, with the quality and quantity of beer carefully specified in labor contracts. Court records from 14th century Essex document a labor dispute where workers walked off the job not because of insufficient pay, but because the employer provided beer of insufficient strength and inadequate measure, essentially accusing their employer of wage theft via watered-down beer. For specialized craft workers like carpenters, masons, and smiths, beer entitlements often accounted for up to a third of their total compensation. This wasn't considered a perk or bonus. It was an expected part of their payment package. Construction accounts for medieval building projects routinely include detailed breakdowns of beer provisions alongside monetary wages. When Winchester Cathedral's treasury was renovated in 1402, the accounts meticulously record both the penny wages and beer allowances for each worker, with master craftsmen receiving significantly better beer than common laborers. Rents and taxes similarly incorporated beer as payment. Tenants might owe their lord a combination of money, agricultural products, labor services, and beer. The Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds in the 13th century collected Tolcester, a beer tax from tenants brewing on their lands, requiring 1 full pitcher from each brewing session. Similar arrangements existed across Europe, with brewing taxes paid in the product itself rather than in currency. The use of beer as payment solved several practical problems in medieval economics. First, actual coinage was chronically scarce throughout much of the period, particularly in rural areas. Many peasants might go months without handling a single coin, conducting their economic lives entirely through barter and in-kind exchanges. Beer, as a relatively standardized product with recognized value, helped fill this currency gap. Second, beer had the advantage of being divisible and somewhat fungible, meaning one unit could substitute for another, though quality variations complicated this. Unlike large agricultural products like livestock, beer could be measured out in precise amounts to match the value of services rendered. A day's casual labor might be worth a gallon of ordinary beer, while more skilled work commanded larger quantities or higher quality brews. Beer also solved the medieval equivalent of the company store problem. Workers paid in beer could immediately consume their earnings or easily trade them with others, unlike payment in goods that required further processing or specialized knowledge to utilize. This made beer uniquely liquid as a form of non-monetary compensation, both literally and in the economic sense. Fascinatingly, some scholars argue that beer functioned as an early standardized unit of value, similar to how grain measures or precious metals served in other economies. Norwegian legal codes from the 10th and 11th centuries sometimes specified fines and compensations in terms of beer volume rather than coinage. One particularly interesting case from 13th century Bavaria shows a property transaction valued partly in measures of good March beer, suggesting beer served as a reference value even when not physically changing hands. The beer as currency system wasn't without complications, however. Quality variations created endless disputes. Was this really the good beer promised as payment, or had it been watered down? Seasonality affected production and value, with beer typically cheaper and more abundant after harvest when grain was plentiful. Storage limitations meant beer wealth couldn't be accumulated long-term the way coinage could. And as with any commodity currency, those who controlled production wielded significant economic power. Regional variations in beer's economic role reflected broader economic patterns. In areas with more developed commercial economies and greater coin circulation, like the wealthy cloth-producing regions of Flanders, beer more commonly functioned as a trade good with monetary price, rather than as direct currency. In more isolated rural regions with limited market integration, beer might serve as the primary medium of exchange well into the later medieval period. The economic role of beer gradually diminished as European economies monetized more fully in the later medieval period. The growing availability of coinage, particularly smaller denominations suitable for everyday transactions, reduced the need for beer as payment. By the 15th century, many labor arrangements that had once specified beer allowances were being commuted to additional money wages, though the tradition of providing workers with drink remained in many regions as a customary right rather than a formal part of compensation. One of the most amusing and telling aspects of beer's economic significance appears in ecclesiastical records. Though the church frequently condemned excessive drinking, it had no qualms about collecting revenues in the form of beer. The Archbishop of Cologne in the 14th century received substantial portions of his income from beer taxes and brewing rights. In England, even parish priests might receive church ales as part of their compensation from parishioners. This pragmatic acceptance of beer as economic reality speaks volumes about its centrality to medieval life. This economic dimension adds an essential layer to our understanding of medieval beer consumption. People weren't just drinking vast quantities of beer because they enjoyed it or because water was unsafe. They were drinking it because beer was quite literally their paycheck, their tax payment, their rent. Beer wasn't just liquid bread, it was liquid wealth. Imagine finding yourself in a medieval schoolroom. A dozen children between the ages of 6 and 10 sit on rough wooden benches, squirming as the schoolmaster drones on about Latin declensions. When midday arrives, the children break for their meal. And what does the schoolmaster distribute alongside their bread and cheese? Not water, not milk, but beer, a lighter, lower alcohol variety known as small beer, but beer nonetheless. If your modern parenting sensibilities are screaming in horror at the thought of elementary schoolers being served alcohol, you've just encountered one of the most jarring disconnects between medieval and contemporary attitudes toward beer consumption. Children drinking beer wasn't just common in medieval Europe. It was actively encouraged as a healthy practice. From the moment they were weaned from breast milk, typically between ages 1 and 3, children were introduced to weak beer as their primary beverage. This practice crossed all social boundaries, from peasant hovels to royal palaces. Royal household accounts from medieval England show that even royal children received beer rations, albeit usually of the weaker variety, known variously as small beer, table beer, or household beer. These children's brews weren't simply adult beer watered down as an afterthought. They represented specific brewing traditions designed to produce beverages with lower alcohol content, typically ranging from 0.5% to 2.5% ABV, alcohol by volume. Small beer was produced through a process called second running, where grains that had already been used for a stronger brew were reused to make a lighter beverage. This economical process extracted maximum value from expensive grain while creating a drink considered appropriate for women, children, and the elderly. Medieval medical authorities actively endorsed beer consumption for children, integrating it into early health theories derived from Greco-Roman medicine. Following Galenic principles of balancing bodily humors, medieval physicians classified different beers according to their effects on the body's internal balance. Lighter beers were considered particularly suitable for children's constitutions, believed to aid digestion and provide necessary moisture without overheating young bodies with excessive alcohol. The 12th century medical text, Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanae, the Salernitan rule of health, which remained influential throughout the medieval period, specifically recommended beer for growing children, asserting it strengthened the body and supported growth. Later medical writers elaborated on these recommendations, suggesting specific types of beer appropriate for different childhood stages and constitutions. Far from being viewed as harmful, beer was considered an essential component of proper childhood nutrition. Educational institutions incorporated beer into their daily regimens. Monastic schools, cathedral schools, and later universities all maintained brewhouses or contracts with local brewers to supply their students. The University of Paris in the 13th century established detailed regulations governing the quality and price of beer served to its scholars, many of whom were teenage boys. Oxford and Cambridge similarly maintained college brewhouses well into the early modern period, considering beer provision an essential part of their educational mission. Apprenticeship contracts routinely specified beer allowances for young trainees, sometimes with fascinating age-based gradations. A 15th century German carpenter's apprenticeship agreement stipulated that the boy would receive 1 quart of small beer daily for his first year, graduating to stronger beer as he aged and his work responsibilities increased. This progression from weaker to stronger beer mirrored the child's transition toward adult responsibilities and status. Parents and guardians took children's beer consumption seriously as a health matter. When Lady Margaret Beaufort sent her 7-year-old son, the future King Henry VII of England, to live in a noble household for his education in 1462, her written instructions specified that he should receive beer not from the common barrel, but from a special brewing overseen by his personal servants. This concern wasn't about providing luxury, but ensuring appropriate quality for a child's health. Archaeological evidence confirms this literary record. Excavations of medieval children's graves have revealed skeletal markers consistent with regular alcohol consumption from early ages. Isotope analysis of remains from medieval cemeteries indicates dietary patterns that align with historical accounts of children consuming grain-based fermented beverages as a daily staple rather than as an occasional treat. Children's participation in beer production further normalized their relationship with the beverage. From an early age, children were involved in household brewing activities, helping to gather ingredients, stir mashes, or monitor fermentation. Girls, in particular, received brewing instruction as part of their domestic education, learning skills they would be expected to deploy when running their own households. By involving children directly in production, medieval society demystified beer and integrated it into normal childhood experience. The routine nature of children's beer consumption is perhaps best illustrated by its appearance in hagiography, stories of saints' lives. Several medieval saints' biographies mention childhood miracles involving beer, such as accidentally spilled beer being restored through divine intervention. These texts assume as unremarkable background that the child saints would naturally be handling or consuming beer, focusing instead on the miraculous elements of the stories. Fascinatingly, there's little evidence in medieval sources of widespread concern about children's consumption of alcohol in the form of beer. While medieval moralists certainly condemned drunkenness for both adults and children, they did not problematize moderate beer consumption by youngsters. The concept of alcohol as categorically inappropriate for children simply didn't exist in medieval thought. This absence of moral panic reflects fundamental differences in how medieval society conceptualized both childhood and alcohol. The medieval view saw childhood less as an innocent state requiring protection and more as a progressive journey toward adult capabilities and responsibilities. Similarly, beer was categorized primarily as food rather than as an intoxicant. The modern sharp distinction between alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages would have seemed artificial to medieval people, who instead distinguished between beverages based on their strength, quality, and appropriate contexts for consumption. Children's consumption of beer declined only gradually as alternatives became available. Tea, coffee, and chocolate, all unknown in medieval Europe, offered new non-alcoholic options in the early modern period, though these remained luxury items for centuries. More significant was the improvement in water quality and milk preservation that slowly made these alternatives safer for everyday consumption. Even so, children continued to drink small beer in many European regions well into the 19th century, particularly in rural areas where brewing traditions remained strong. This historically distant practice of children regularly consuming beer challenges our modern assumptions about both childhood and alcohol. Medieval children weren't being neglected or endangered by this practice. Quite the opposite. Their parents and caretakers provided beer precisely because they cared about children's health and well-being. Operating within a medical and cultural framework that saw moderate beer consumption as beneficial rather than harmful. As you drift toward sleep, consider how different our understanding of appropriate children's beverages might look if history had taken different turns, and how many of our own obvious health practices might seem equally bizarre to our medieval ancestors. The sun has barely crested the horizon when she begins. A medieval woman, let's call her Marjorie, moves methodically through her small home, preparing for one of her household's most essential tasks, brewing the month's supply of beer. She checks her stores of grain, arranges her brewing vessels, and begins the hours-long process of transforming simple ingredients into the beverage that will sustain her family for weeks to come. What you're witnessing isn't an occasional household chore, but a fundamental economic activity performed primarily by women across medieval Europe. For centuries, brewing wasn't a male-dominated industry, but rather the domain of women known as brewsters, alewives, or beer wives, the original craft brewers of the medieval world. Brewing began as a domestic activity firmly embedded within women's household responsibilities. Just as women were expected to prepare food, weave cloth, and manage daily household consumption, they were tasked with producing the beer that family members would drink daily. Archaeological evidence from early medieval settlements consistently shows brewing equipment located within the domestic sphere, often positioned near other food preparation areas. These weren't large-scale operations, but rather modest setups producing enough for household needs, with perhaps small surpluses to trade or sell locally. The brewing process itself fitted neatly into women's daily rhythms. Brewing required attention at specific intervals, but left time between steps for other household tasks. A woman might set grains to soak before tending to children, return to heat the mixture while overseeing other domestic activities, add flavoring herbs while preparing the family meal, and monitor fermentation while completing textile work. This integration with existing household labor patterns made brewing a natural extension of women's economic contributions to family survival. Skills passed from mother to daughter, creating multi-generational traditions of female brewing expertise. Young girls learned brewing techniques alongside other domestic arts, often beginning as assistants by age 7 or 8. By their mid-teens, many young women could independently manage the entire brewing process. This knowledge transmission created localized brewing traditions, with recipes and techniques developing distinctive regional characteristics as they passed through generations of female brewers. As settlements grew and urbanization increased throughout the medieval period, some women expanded beyond brewing merely for their households. Women with particularly strong brewing skills or additional capacity began selling surplus beer, initially from their homes and later at markets or in primitive taverns. These commercial brewsters represented an important category of medieval female entrepreneurs, generating independent income in an economic landscape that offered women limited opportunities for financial autonomy. Court records, guild documents, and tax rolls from across medieval Europe attest to women's dominance in commercial brewing through much of the period. In 14th century England, brewing licenses known as alewife licenses were overwhelmingly issued to women. In Hamburg, during the same period, tax records indicate that approximately 70% of brewers were female. Similar patterns appear in records from France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia, confirming that women's brewing wasn't a localized phenomenon, but a widespread economic reality. The visual culture of the period reflects this female brewing dominance. Manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries routinely depict brewing as women's work, showing female figures engaged in various stages of the brewing process. The iconography of St. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess known for writing about brewing, often shows her overseeing brewing activities, reinforcing the connection between women and beer production. Linguistically, many languages developed specific feminine forms for brewers long before masculine equivalents became common. In English, brewster was the feminine form, with the stir suffix indicating a female practitioner, as in spinster. In German, Brauerin specifically denoted a female brewer. These linguistic markers highlight the extent to which brewing was conceptualized as women's work before later gender shifts in the industry. The alewife or brewster became a stock character in medieval literature and folklore, often portrayed with ambivalence. On one hand, skilled brewsters were respected for their craft and economic contributions. On the other, alewives sometimes appeared as objects of satire or suspicion, accused of watering down their product or using questionable ingredients. This dual representation reflects both the essential nature of women's brewing work and the anxieties surrounding women who operated with relative independence in the public economic sphere. One particularly fascinating aspect of female brewing was its connection to magical and medicinal knowledge. The addition of herbs and plants to beer for flavoring and preservation overlapped considerably with women's traditional role as healers and keepers of herbal lore. Brewery accounts sometimes show women purchasing herbs that had both brewing applications and medicinal uses, suggesting a blending of these knowledge traditions. This connection occasionally led to darker associations. Some women accused of witchcraft in later periods were first identified through their brewing activities. Their knowledge of fermentation and herbs rendering them suspect in communities gripped by supernatural fears. Beginning in the late 13th century and accelerating through the 14th and 15th centuries, brewing began a significant gender transformation. What had been primarily women's work gradually became dominated by men, particularly in urban centers. This transition wasn't accidental or simply evolutionary. It represented a deliberate effort to masculinize and professionalize a lucrative industry that had traditionally been female-controlled. The mechanisms of this gender shift were varied but interconnected. The formation of brewers' guilds played a crucial role, establishing formal structures that often explicitly excluded women or limited their participation. Guild regulations frequently prohibited women from taking apprentices outside their immediate family, restricted widows' rights to continue their husbands' brewing operations, or imposed different fee structures on female members. In Cologne, the Brewers' Guild, established in 1396, admitted women only as the wives or daughters of male guild members, effectively ending independent female participation in the commercial brewing industry. Technological changes accelerated this gender transformation as brewing equipment grew larger and more expensive, requiring greater capital investment. Many women were edged out of commercial production. The shift from brewing in wooden or ceramic vessels to metal cauldrons, and eventually to dedicated brewhouses, represented not just a technical evolution, but a socio-economic one that increasingly disadvantaged female producers, who typically had less access to capital and credit than their male counterparts. The increasing scale of brewing operations also contributed to women's exclusion. Early medieval brewing typically produced relatively small batches intended for immediate consumption by households or local communities. As urban populations grew, demand increased for larger-scale production that could supply entire neighborhoods or institutions. These larger operations required more space, more equipment, and more labor, all resources that women had more difficulty accessing within medieval social structures. Legal restrictions further constrained women's brewing activities. Some towns implemented ordinances specifically limiting women's brewing rights or imposing different and typically more stringent quality controls on female brewers than on their male counterparts. A 1540 proclamation in London prohibited women from operating alehouses unless they were widows of former publicans, effectively restricting new female entrants to the trade. By the end of the medieval period, women's role in brewing had diminished significantly, particularly in urban centers. Commercial brewing had largely become a male occupation, with women's participation increasingly marginal or invisible. The brewster was gradually replaced by the brewer, transforming what had been for centuries a female-dominated craft into the male-dominated industry that would characterize brewing through the modern era. Yet, despite this transformation, the legacy of medieval brewsters remains evident in brewing history. Many brewing techniques, recipes, and traditions that formed the foundation of European beer culture were developed and refined by generations of female brewers before being appropriated into the male-dominated commercial brewing industry. As you drift towards sleep, picture Marjorie and countless women like her, their skilled hands creating the beverage that sustained medieval Europe, their expertise forming the unseen foundation of brewing traditions that continue to this day. Night has fallen across the medieval town. The narrow streets are dark and dangerous, but golden light spills from a half-timbered building where voices rise and fall in a rhythm as old as civilization itself. Inside, a cross-section of medieval society gathers in the smoky warmth. Peasants nursing cups of ale after a day in the fields. Merchants discussing the latest shipment from Flanders. A wandering friar sharing news from distant parishes. And in the corner, two guild masters quietly negotiating terms for the coming year's apprentices. You've entered the medieval alehouse, tavern, or inn, not just a place to drink, but one of society's most vital institutions, a hub of communication, commerce, and community that helped bind the fragmented world of medieval Europe together. The medieval drinking establishment went by many names: alehouse, tavern, inn, hostelry, beer house, each with subtle distinctions in function and status, though modern historians often group them together as public houses. The simplest alehouse might be nothing more than the front room of a peasant cottage, where a woman sold her home-brewed ale to neighbors. At the other extreme, grand urban taverns in commercial centers like Bruges or London might feature multiple rooms, hired serving staff, and facilities for storing and serving different beverages, including wine and imported beer. What united these diverse establishments was their fundamental role in medieval social life. In an era before coffee shops, restaurants, public parks, or community centers, the tavern served as the primary space for public gathering and social interaction outside of church. For many medieval people, particularly those of the lower classes, the local alehouse represented the only indoor public space where they could gather without direct oversight from religious or secular authorities. The centrality of taverns to community life is evident in their sheer numbers. Records from late 14th century England suggest that many villages had at least one alehouse for every 20-30 adult inhabitants. Oxford in 1390 had at least 50 documented taverns serving a population of approximately 5,000, a ratio that would make modern public health officials blanch. Continental cities showed similar patterns, with 15th century Munich recording over 60 public brewing houses, plus numerous smaller alehouses within its walls. These establishments fulfilled social functions far beyond simple alcohol distribution. Most fundamentally, they served as information exchanges in a society without mass media or widespread literacy. News traveled along medieval roads, and wherever travelers stopped to drink, information flowed. A peasant who rarely ventured beyond neighboring fields might learn of distant wars, plagues, or political developments from travelers sharing stories over ale. Market prices, weather patterns, approaching armies, miracle reports, and royal scandals all circulated through tavern talk, creating loose but essential information networks spanning the medieval landscape. Business transactions regularly occurred in tavern settings, with ale or beer serving as both social lubricant and ritual component of deal-making. Guild records show that apprenticeship agreements, land transfers, and commercial contracts were commonly finalized over drinks, with the parties involved purchasing covenant ale to ceremonially seal their arrangement. In some regions, Witnesses to these tavern-based agreements could later be called to testify that they had seen the parties drink upon their bargain, lending legal weight to transactions conducted in these semi-public spaces. Local governance often intersected with tavern culture. Village meetings, minor court proceedings, and tax collections frequently took place in alehouses for practical reasons. They were among the few spaces large enough to accommodate groups while providing benches, tables, and shelter. This practice was so common that the boundary between tavern and town hall blurred in smaller communities, with some drinking establishments evolving into dedicated civic spaces over time, while maintaining their function as places of refreshment. Guild activities particularly centered around taverns. Beyond their role in formalizing business arrangements, guilds used specific taverns as regular meeting places, sometimes maintaining permanent rooms or storage areas within them. Craft guild members might gather monthly to discuss trade regulations, share technical knowledge, resolve disputes, or simply cultivate the social bonds necessary for their economic networks to function smoothly. The tavern provided neutral territory where masters, journeymen, and apprentices could interact outside the hierarchical workshop environment, facilitating knowledge transfer and community cohesion. Politically, taverns occasionally served as incubators for dissent and organizing. Peasant rebellions from the 1381 English Rising to the German Peasants' War of 1524-25 included organizing activities in local drinking establishments where grievances could be shared and plans formulated beyond the direct surveillance of authorities. Recognizing this potential, many medieval governments attempted to monitor tavern talk through networks of informants, or by requiring innkeepers to report suspicious conversations. Early examples of surveillance in public spaces. The church maintained an ambivalent relationship with tavern culture. On one hand, ecclesiastical authorities regularly condemned excessive drinking and the moral dangers of tavern socialization. Sermons warned against the sins encountered in alehouses, and penitential literature prescribed specific penances for various tavern-related transgressions. On the other hand, many taverns were owned by religious institutions that benefited from their revenues, and clergy were among their regular patrons despite prohibitions against clerical tavern attendance. This clerical presence in drinking establishments appears regularly in both regulatory documents and literary sources. Church councils repeatedly issued prohibitions against priests drinking in taverns, prohibitions whose frequent repetition suggests limited effectiveness. The Canterbury Tales famously depicts a summoner and friar intimately familiar with tavern life, while court records occasionally mention clergy involved in tavern brawls or drinking contests. These contradictions reflect the reality that taverns were too central to medieval social functioning for even the church to successfully stand apart from them. Entertainment remained a crucial aspect of tavern appeal. Professional storytellers, musicians, and performers circulated among drinking establishments, exchanging their skills for drinks, meals, or small payments from patrons. Simple gambling games involving dice or cards created additional entertainment while offering the prospect, usually illusory, of improving one's financial situation. More elaborate diversions might include bear baiting, cockfighting, or public contests in establishments with suitable space. For travelers, taverns and inns provided essential services beyond drink. In larger establishments, particularly those along major routes, accommodations might range from simple floor space near the hearth to private chambers for wealthier guests. Stabling for horses, secure storage for goods, meal service, and basic information about local conditions made the network of medieval inns an essential infrastructure supporting commercial and communication networks across Europe. The social world of the tavern wasn't entirely inclusive, showing similar stratifications to broader medieval society. Gender dynamics varied by region and period, but generally, taverns represented more masculine social spaces, though women participated as both servers and patrons. Economic distinctions remained visible, with separate rooms or seating areas often designated for patrons of different status. Ethnic and religious divisions might determine which establishments welcomed particular patrons, especially in diverse urban centers. Nevertheless, medieval taverns facilitated social mixing to a degree unusual in a highly stratified society. A 15th century drinking establishment might simultaneously host laborers, merchants, minor clergy, and off-duty soldiers, creating opportunities for cross-class interaction rare in other contexts. This mixing occasionally concerned authorities who implemented regulations attempting to segregate drinking spaces by social class, regulations whose repeated reissuance suggests they were widely ignored. As you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself in that smoky medieval tavern, the complex social ecosystem contained within its walls, conversations flowing as freely as the beer. Beyond mere drinking houses, these establishments formed essential nodes in communication networks, commercial systems, and community structures that helped bind together the disparate elements of medieval society. The shared cup did what political structures often couldn't. It created spaces where information, ideas, and experiences could flow across the rigid boundaries of medieval social hierarchy. The monastery bells ring for vespers as Brother Thomas moves purposefully toward the brewhouse. Despite the approaching evening prayers, he isn't shirking his religious duties, he's fulfilling them. As the monastery's master brewer, His work is as much an act of devotion as the psalms soon to be chanted in the chapel. He makes the sign of the cross over the fermenting wort, murmuring a Latin blessing, asking for St. Arnold's intercession to protect the brew from spoilage. This isn't superstition or mere habit. It's a profound recognition of brewing as a sacred activity, blessed by God and essential to religious life. You're witnessing the deep, often overlooked connection between medieval beer and religious practice, a relationship that shaped both brewing traditions and spiritual expression throughout medieval Europe. Beer's integration into religious life began at the highest levels of church hierarchy. The rule of St. Benedict, which guided monastic life throughout the medieval period, specifically addressed beer consumption, recommending a hemina, roughly a pint daily for each monk. This wasn't just practical nutrition. The regulated consumption of beer became part of the structured spiritual discipline that ordered monastic existence. Beer drinking occurred at prescribed times, accompanied by appropriate prayers, transforming an ordinary activity into a component of religious observance. Religious calendars profoundly influenced brewing schedules and consumption patterns. The medieval Christian year alternated between feasts and fasts, celebrations and penitential periods, each with specific dietary regulations affecting beer production and consumption. During Lent's 40 days of fasting, many monasteries brewed special fasting beer, sometimes called liquid bread, that was both more nutritious and less pleasurable than standard brews, meeting the letter of fasting requirements while sustaining monks through periods of reduced food intake. Conversely, major feast days required brewing larger quantities of higher quality beer to properly celebrate religious holidays. The Catholic Church eventually recognized several patron saints specifically associated with brewing, creating a spiritual framework that elevated brewing from mere craft to divinely sanctioned activity. Saint Arnold, or Arnulf, of Metz, gained particular prominence after allegedly purifying a brewery's water supply, saving local residents from illness. Saint Hildegard of Bingen wrote extensively about brewing techniques and beer's medicinal properties. Saint Augustine of Hippo, while not exclusively a brewing patron, was frequently invoked by brewers for protection against spoilage. These saints' days became occasions for special brewing activities, blessings of brewing equipment, and communal celebrations among those involved in beer production. Brewing equipment itself often bore religious inscriptions or symbols intended to invoke divine protection over the brewing process. Excavated medieval brewing vessels have revealed crosses, abbreviated prayers, or saints' names scratched into their surfaces. More elaborate brewhouses might feature permanent religious imagery, paintings, or carvings of patron saints. Biblical scenes related to hospitality or transformation, or protective religious symbols positioned to watch over the brewing process. These weren't mere decorations, but integral spiritual technologies believed to safeguard both the physical beer and the souls of those who would consume it. Religious rituals surrounded every stage of the brewing process. The selection and measuring of grain might begin with prayers for abundance. Water drawn for brewing would be blessed before use. The addition of yeast, that mysterious agent of transformation, not scientifically understood until the 19th century, was particularly surrounded by religious practice, with specific prayers asking for successful fermentation. Many brewing manuals from monasteries include religious formulas to be recited at critical moments in the brewing process, demonstrating the inseparability of technical knowledge and spiritual practice. Beer itself served important sacramental and ceremonial functions beyond everyday consumption. While wine remained the liturgical beverage for the Eucharist, beer played roles in other religious ceremonies and observances. Ritual blessings of new beer took place on specific feast days, particularly those associated with harvest or brewing patron saints. Some regions practiced church ales, special brewing events where parishioners contributed ingredients for beer brewed specifically to raise funds for church maintenance or charitable activities. The resulting blessed beer carried spiritual significance beyond ordinary brews. Religious holidays created peaks in beer consumption that shaped the entire brewing calendar. Christmas and Easter, as the two most important Christian festivals, required substantial beer production in the weeks preceding them. Records from medieval English parishes show brewers working overtime to meet demand for these celebrations, while monastery accounts indicate dramatically increased consumption during major feast periods. Saints' days, particularly those of local importance, similarly required special brewing preparations, often with specific types of beer associated with particular celebrations. The religious significance of beer extended beyond Christianity into older folk practices that persisted, sometimes uneasily, alongside Orthodox observance. Pre-Christian traditions of offering libations to ensure fertility or protection were Christianized, but not eliminated, transforming into practices like the blessing of fields with beer-soaked branches, or the ceremonial sharing of beer at critical agricultural transitions like planting and harvest. The Church generally attempted to absorb, rather than eradicate, these practices, redirecting them toward Christian saints or observances, while maintaining their essential communal function. Interreligious tensions occasionally centered around beer and its production. In regions with significant Jewish populations, different brewing traditions created both economic competition and cultural friction. Jewish brewers typically produced beer without certain additives prohibited under kosher dietary laws, resulting in distinct products that sometimes enjoyed wider popularity despite religious prejudices. In areas where Christianity encountered Muslim populations, such as medieval Spain or the Crusader states, contrasting attitudes toward alcohol created additional cultural boundaries, with beer consumption becoming a visible marker of religious identity. Beer production even influenced church architecture in certain regions. Some monastery complexes included specially designed water systems that supplied both the brewing operation and other monastic needs, representing significant engineering investments. Grain storage facilities attached to churches sometimes served brewing purposes alongside their role in collecting tithes or preparing communion bread. In some parishes, church buildings themselves occasionally housed brewing equipment in ancillary spaces, particularly for the production of ceremonial or fundraising brews. Popular religious practices incorporated beer in ways official theology might not explicitly endorse, but generally tolerated. Folk healing traditions often involved beer as both medicine and ritual element, with specific brews prescribed for various ailments, according to a system that blended empirical observation with religious symbolism. Protective charms written on parchment might be dipped in beer before consumption to treat internal ailments, combining the material properties of beer with the spiritual power of sacred words. Medieval literary sources reveal the deep integration of beer into religious imagination. Saints' lives occasionally feature beer-related miracles, such as vessels miraculously refilling, or spoiled beer becoming wholesome through divine intervention. Exemplary tales warned against blasphemy or excess while drinking, recounting supernatural punishments for those who abused God's gift of beer. Conversely, stories praised the generosity of those who shared beer with the needy, portraying such hospitality as a practical expression of Christian charity. Religious authorities maintained complex attitudes toward beer consumption. While moderation was universally encouraged, precise definitions varied widely between orders and regions. The Cistercians generally advocated greater restraint than Benedictines, while mendicant friars navigating secular society developed yet different norms. All agreed that drunkenness constituted sinful excess, but none questioned the fundamental legitimacy of beer itself. Instead, the virtue lay in proper use of this divine gift, consumption with gratitude, moderation, and awareness of beer's proper place within God's ordered creation. As you edge closer to sleep, consider how thoroughly the sacred and secular intertwined in medieval brewing. To separate beer from religious practice would have been incomprehensible to medieval minds. The brewer's craft wasn't merely technical, but spiritual. The drink itself wasn't merely physical, but sacramental. Each step in brewing carried religious significance, each drinking occasion its appropriate rituals and limitations. Beer wasn't just about physical sustenance. It was about maintaining right relationship with God, community, and creation in a world where the sacred permeated every aspect of daily life. You find yourself in a 12th century brewing room, watching a woman carefully measuring ingredients for her next batch. What draws your attention isn't the barley or water, but the curious collection of herbs and plants she's preparing to add to the brew. There's no hops among them. Instead, she selects sprigs of yarrow, bog myrtle, mugwort, ground ivy, and wild rosemary. She measures them precisely, muttering what might be prayers or technical reminders as she works. You're witnessing the preparation of gruit, the nearly forgotten herbal mixture that flavored and preserved most European beer for centuries before hops became the brewer's plant of choice. This aromatic, complex, and sometimes psychoactive blend represented an entire brewing tradition that has largely vanished from modern consciousness, but dominated medieval brewing for most of the period. Gruit, also spelled grut, grite, or grout, wasn't a single herb, but a varying mixture of plants selected for their preservative properties, flavoring potential, and effects on the drinker. The exact composition varied regionally, seasonally, and according to the brewer's specific intentions, but typically included a combination of bitter herbs to balance the malt's sweetness, aromatics for pleasant flavor, and preservative agents to extend the beer's drinkable life. The base of most gruit mixtures included bog myrtle myrica gale, yarrow Achillea millefolium, and wild rosemary ledum pallister, often supplemented with other herbs like mugwort Artemisia vulgaris, ground ivy Glechoma heteracea, juniper berries, caraway seed, aniseed, or ginger. The origins of gruit brewing stretch back into pre-medieval Europe, with archaeological evidence suggesting Germanic and Celtic peoples were adding herbal mixtures to fermented beverages long before the medieval period. Written references to gruit appear by the 9th century, when Carolingian capitularies, royal ordinances, mentioned regulations surrounding its production and use. By the early medieval period, gruit was firmly established as the standard flavoring and preservative agent for beer across much of Northern Europe. The sensory experience of drinking gruit ale differed dramatically from modern hopped beer. Contemporary beer writers who have attempted to recreate medieval gruit recipes describe complex, aromatic beverages with layered herbal notes, sometimes floral, sometimes medicinal, sometimes resinous, that balanced the sweet maltiness of the base beer. The mouthfeel was typically fuller and smoother than hopped beer, with less sharp bitterness, but more complex palate sensations. The overall effect was reportedly more like a botanical infusion than the clean, crisp profile modern beer drinkers expect. Beyond flavor, gruit herbs were selected for their preservative qualities. In an era before refrigeration or modern sanitization. Preventing spoilage was crucial to brewing success. Many common gruit herbs contain natural antimicrobial compounds that inhibited bacterial growth and slowed spoilage. Bog myrtle, for instance, contains specific oils that act as preservatives, while yarrow has documented antibacterial properties. While less effective than hops at preservation, these herbs extended beer's drinkable life significantly compared to unherbed alternatives. Perhaps most interestingly, some gruit herbs possessed mild psychoactive properties that may have enhanced beer's effects beyond simple alcohol content. Herbs like mugwort and wild rosemary, ledum pallister, contain compounds that can be mildly intoxicating, sedative, or even hallucinogenic in sufficient quantities. Some archaeological evidence suggests ancient Germanic tribes deliberately selected herbs with such properties for ritual brewing, and these traditions may have continued into the medieval period, albeit with less explicit acknowledgement after Christianization. The preparation of gruit was neither standardized nor casual. Many regions had specific individuals, often women, with herbal knowledge, who specialized in creating gruit mixtures. These specialists would select, dry, and blend herbs in carefully guarded proportions, selling their mixtures to brewers, or preparing them for their own brewing operations. Their knowledge was typically passed through family lines rather than formal documentation, creating localized traditions that varied widely across Europe. Gruit production eventually became subject to tight regulation in many regions. By the 11th century, various secular and religious authorities had established gruit rights, Latin jus gruti, monopolizing the production and sale of official gruit mixtures within their territories. These gruit rights became significant revenue sources for their holders, whether monasteries, noble families, or town authorities. Brewers were required to purchase official gruit at fixed prices or pay taxes for the privilege of using their own herbal mixtures. The economic significance of gruit cannot be overstated. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, gruit taxes provided substantial income for local authorities, sometimes accounting for a significant percentage of municipal or ecclesiastical revenues. The Bishop of Münster, for example, derived considerable income from his gruit monopoly, as did the cathedral chapter of Utrecht. The precise worth of these gruit rights is difficult to calculate in modern terms, but their frequent mention in property disputes and taxation records indicates their substantial value. Regional variations in gruit tradition created distinct brewing identities across medieval Europe. Northern German gruit typically emphasized bog myrtle, while English traditions more commonly featured ground ivy. Scandinavian brewing often incorporated juniper, while Belgian traditions might include specific local herbs unavailable elsewhere. These regional differences created beer, terroir, as distinctive as wine regions, with travelers noting the characteristic flavors of different areas' brews. Gruit's cultural significance extended beyond mere flavoring. In many regions, particular herbs were associated with specific festivals or seasons, creating distinctive beers for different occasions. Spring brewing might incorporate newly sprouted herbs believed to have purifying properties, while winter brews might include more warming, spice-like ingredients. These seasonal variations connected beer consumption to the agricultural and liturgical calendar, reinforcing community observances through shared sensory experiences. The decline of Gruit brewing began gradually with the introduction of hopped beer, a process that unfolded unevenly across Europe over several centuries. Hops, Humulus lupulus, had been known since ancient times, but weren't widely used in brewing until the early medieval period, when they began appearing in monastic records, particularly from Carolingian monasteries. By the 12th century, hopped beer was common in some regions, particularly parts of Germany, while Gruit ales remained dominant elsewhere. The transition from Gruit to hops represented more than a simple flavor preference. Hops offered superior preservative properties through their high alpha acid content, extending beer's shelf life significantly beyond what Gruit herbs could achieve. This preservative advantage became increasingly important as brewing scaled up from household production to commercial operations serving growing urban populations. Beer that could travel farther and last longer had obvious economic advantages in an expanding commercial environment. Religious factors may have influenced the shift as well. Some historians argue that the mildly psychoactive properties of certain Gruit herbs drew clerical disapproval, particularly as the church sought to regulate intoxicants more strictly. Hops, by contrast, have a mild sedative effect without the other psychoactive properties associated with herbs like mugwort, potentially making hopped beer more acceptable to ecclesiastical authorities concerned with maintaining proper behavior. The economics of the Gruit to hops transition created significant conflicts. Authorities holding valuable Gruit rights saw their revenue threatened by the new brewing method and often attempted to restrict hop usage through regulations or outright bans. Hamburg notably prohibited hopped beer until 1476, while in England, Henry V attempted to outlaw hopped beer as an unwholesome adulteration in 1471, likely under pressure from interests benefiting from traditional brewing taxes. Despite resistance, hops gradually displaced Gruit across Europe, advancing from east to west over several centuries. By 1500, hopped beer had become standard across most of Germany and the Low Countries. England held out longer, with Gruit ales referred to simply as ale to distinguish them from hopped beer, remaining common until the early 17th century. By the early modern period, gruit brewing had largely disappeared from commercial production, though some household or small-scale brewing preserved elements of the tradition in remote areas. The transition from gruit to hops represents one of brewing history's most significant turning points, effectively erasing an entire sensory and cultural tradition that had dominated European brewing for centuries. Modern attempts to recreate gruit ales must contend with fragmentary documentation, as brewing texts rarely recorded exact proportions or preparation methods for herb mixtures that were typically purchased pre-mixed from specialized suppliers. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the aromatic complexity of that medieval brewing room, not the clean, sharp scent of hops that dominates modern brewing, but a botanical apothecary of herbs with properties both medicinal and mysterious. The tradition of gruit may have largely vanished, but it represents a fascinating reminder that brewing history isn't a simple linear progression toward modern practices, but a complex story of cultural choices, economic pressures, and changing tastes that might easily have taken different paths. Remember those alewives we discussed earlier, those capable women who brewed from their kitchens, hanging ale stakes outside their doors to signal fresh batches. Their primacy in brewing was so established that the Anglo-Saxon word brewster specifically denoted a female brewer. For centuries, brewing was considered women's work, an extension of their domestic duties alongside baking and cooking. Their knowledge passed from mother to daughter in an unbroken chain stretching back to before recorded history. Yet by the late 14th century, something remarkable had happened. In towns across England, France, and the Germanic regions, brewing had largely transformed from a cottage industry dominated by women into a commercial enterprise controlled by men. This wasn't a natural evolution. It was a calculated power grab executed with precision over generations. The brewing guilds emerged as the primary mechanisms for this transition. These formal associations of brewers began appearing in urban centers during the 13th century. London's Brewers' Guild was officially recognized in 1342, though informal associations existed earlier. Similar organizations sprouted in cities like Hamburg, Bruges, and Paris. Initially, these guilds included some women members, particularly widows continuing their husbands' businesses. But gradually, their regulations systematically squeezed women from the trade. The process was insidious in its thoroughness. Guild regulations increasingly required expensive specialized equipment that domestic brewers couldn't afford. They mandated apprenticeships that women were barred from entering. They required members to own property in their own name, a right many married women didn't possess. Some guilds even instituted physical tests, supposedly demonstrating the strength required for commercial brewing, conveniently ignoring that women had been lugging water buckets and grain sacks for centuries. Court records from 14th century London show the results. Women were increasingly prosecuted for brewing without guild membership, effectively criminalizing the household brewing tradition that had sustained communities for generations. A Bremen ordinance from 1381 flatly stated that no woman shall brew, attempting to erase, with a single sentence, centuries of female brewing expertise. What's particularly interesting about this transition is how quickly the cultural narrative shifted. Remember the common medieval illustrations of brewery scenes we discussed earlier. In 12th century manuscripts, brewing is depicted as women's work. By the 15th century, brewers are almost universally portrayed as men, often with women relegated to serving roles. The occupation, once considered inherently feminine, had been entirely rebranded as skilled male labor, requiring technical expertise. The economic incentives driving this transformation were considerable. As urban populations grew, brewing at scale became increasingly profitable. The introduction of hopped beer, which kept longer than traditional ale, enabled larger production batches and wider distribution networks. What had been a subsistence activity or small supplementary income for households became a lucrative commercial enterprise. And as brewing grew more profitable, men systematically worked to control it. This pattern wasn't unique to brewing, of course. We see similar trajectories in other medieval trades like textile production and midwifery. As professions became more lucrative and prestigious, they tended to shift from female to male control. But brewing offers perhaps the most complete example of this gendered economic transition. Don't imagine this was a bloodless coup. Alewives fought back. Court records from York to Ghent show women continuing to brew despite prohibitions, sometimes paying fines as a cost of doing business, sometimes finding loopholes in guild regulations. In some regions, particularly rural areas where guild influence was weaker, women maintained their brewing traditions well into the 16th century. But the broader trajectory was clear and irreversible. By 1500, commercial brewing in most European towns had transformed into a male-dominated industry structured around guilds. The breweries themselves had changed from kitchen corners to dedicated facilities with specialized equipment. Production volumes had increased from a few gallons to hundreds of barrels. Distribution had expanded from neighborhood to regional networks, and the gender of the typical brewer had flipped from female to male. This transformation didn't just change who made the beer, it changed the beer itself. Guild brewers increasingly standardized their products, both to meet guild quality regulations and to establish recognizable brands in the emerging commercial market. The diverse array of household brewing techniques, each alewife with her own slightly different recipe and method, gave way to more uniform production methods. That marvelous regional diversity we've discussed wasn't eliminated, but it was certainly constrained by guild standardization. The social experience of consuming beer transformed alongside production. The intimate space of an alewife's kitchen, where neighbors might gather around her table, gave way to purpose-built taverns with their specialized architecture and social codes. The brewster who knew every customer personally was replaced by a chain of commercial relationships, guild brewer to tavern owner to customer. Something personal was lost in this transition, even as production efficiency increased. Yet we shouldn't romanticize pre-guild brewing either. Quality could be wildly inconsistent, and contamination was common. Guild regulations, for all their exclusionary practices, did help establish quality standards that benefited consumers. The larger production volumes enabled by commercial brewing helped ensure more consistent supplies in growing urban centers where sporadic household production couldn't meet demand. The story of alewives and brewing guilds reminds us that beer wasn't just a drink in medieval society. It was an economic battleground where gender, commerce, and power intersected in complex ways. The ale in your cup reflected not just ingredients and brewing techniques, but social hierarchies and economic structures. In northern Germany, particularly in towns like Hamburg and Bremen, that would later form the Hanseatic League, brewing traditions centered around intensely hopped beers that could survive long sea voyages. By the late 13th century, Hamburg had become such a brewing powerhouse that its beer was exported throughout the Baltic, creating what was perhaps medieval Europe's first international beer brand. The Hamburg brewers jealously guarded their techniques and recipes, embedding their brewing practices so deeply in local identity that city laws treated beer quality as a matter of civic pride. When Hamburg ships arrived in foreign ports, their beer announced their origin as clearly as any flag. Cross into Flanders, and you'd encounter a brewing tradition that favored mixed fermentation with local wild yeasts, creating tart, complex ales that shared more DNA with modern sour beers than with their German neighbors. Flemish brewers often aged their beer in wooden vats, allowing the resident microorganisms to impart distinctive regional flavors. The beer of Ghent tasted different from the beer of Bruges, which differed from that of Antwerp, each city fiercely defending its brewing heritage as superior to its neighbors. Travel south into France, and wheat beers dominated, particularly in regions where grape cultivation was challenging. Northern French brewing incorporated extensive use of hops earlier than many regions, while areas closer to wine-producing regions often brewed seasonal beers that supplemented rather than competed with wine consumption. French monastic breweries developed particular regional specialties. The beer of Saint-Denis differed markedly from that of Mont Saint Michel, with travelers specifically seeking out these local specialties. England presented its own patchwork of brewing traditions, with notable distinctions between the heavy, sweet ales of East Anglia and the lighter, drier brews of Kent. The availability of different grain varieties heavily influenced these regional variations. Barley grew abundantly in some regions, while others relied more heavily on oats or rye. By the 14th century, regions had become so associated with their brewing styles that ale names often incorporated place names. London ale or Norwich beer signified not just origin, but a specific style and quality expectation. What's particularly fascinating about these regional variations is how deliberately they were maintained. When brewing techniques or ingredients from one region proved successful, neighboring areas didn't simply adopt them wholesale. Instead, techniques were modified and adapted to maintain local distinctiveness. This wasn't mere stubbornness. Regional beer styles served as cultural markers, ways of asserting, this is who we are, in a world where cultural boundaries were constantly shifting. Consider how regional beer preferences affected medieval social interactions. Marriage alliances between noble families from different regions might require accommodating divergent beer expectations at wedding feasts. Diplomatic envoys would be carefully served their preferred beer styles as a gesture of respect. Pilgrims could track their journey not just by landmarks, but by the changing character of the beer available at each night's lodging. The ingredients themselves varied dramatically by region, creating further distinctiveness. In areas where hops were scarce, brewers turned to local alternatives for bittering and preservation. Swedish brewers used bog myrtle. Scottish brewers incorporated heather flowers. Baltic brewers used juniper branches. Each of these botanical additions created brews unique to their regions, impossible to properly replicate elsewhere. Yeast, too, played a critical role in regional identity, though medieval brewers didn't understand its function as we do today. They knew only that their brewing magic lived in the wooden stirring sticks, vats, and troughs passed down through generations. When brewers migrated between regions, they often brought these tools, unwittingly carrying their regional yeast strains with them. There are fascinating accounts of brewers being specifically hired to relocate and bring their brewing magic to new regions, only to find their beer tasted different when produced with local water and materials. Water chemistry, something medieval brewers couldn't analyze, but certainly experienced, further reinforced regional distinctiveness. The hard water of Burton-upon-Trent in England naturally complemented the production of stronger, more heavily hopped ales, while the soft water of Pilsen in what is now the Czech Republic favored lighter, more delicate brews. Brewers instinctively adapted their techniques to work with local water sources, creating beers that that were literally impossible to replicate elsewhere. These regional differences weren't just matters of production. They shaped consumption patterns as well. Some regions favored weaker beer, consumed in larger quantities throughout the day, while others produced stronger brews meant for more moderate consumption. Serving temperatures varied regionally, as did the typical vessel's beer was served in from wooden mugs in Germany to earthenware jugs in parts of England to leather jacks in Scotland. Regional brewing traditions became so entrenched that they often received official protection. By the late medieval period, cities were passing ordinances dictating precisely what could be called the local beer style. The Munich Beer Purity Regulations of 1487, predecessors to the more famous Reinheitsgebot of 1516, specifically protected local brewing methods against outside innovations. These weren't just quality control measures. They were defenses of cultural identity against homogenization. What's particularly poignant about these regional traditions is how they created emotional connections to place. Medieval people might have lacked our modern concept of nationalism, but they deeply understood local pride. The taste of their local beer was the taste of home. For travelers, merchants, and soldiers, finding their regional beer abroad was a powerful connection to their birthplace. There are touching accounts in medieval letters of homesick scholars and diplomats specifically requesting beer from their home regions as a comfort against the disorientation of foreign lands.